Good evening and welcome to Health Quest. I'm Deborah Arneson, your host once again for the evening, and tonight we have an incredible show for all of you. We have a very special guest. Mr. Mark Johnson is visiting us from Utah, and he is the co-founder and president of Trinity Waters in Utah. So Mark, thank you for joining us. You're a long way from home, and we're really, not Utah, Idaho. Did I say Utah?
It's Idaho.
It's Idaho. Yeah, I was just out in Idaho. How could I forget that? So anyway, we're thrilled to have you here. And we're going to be talking to you tonight about our water sources, and certainly the waters that all of us are exposed to and have the option of drinking or leaving on the shelf, etc. And Mark is a wealth of knowledge. We just had dinner and just touched the tip of the iceberg, and we were talking about waters, and his water in particular, which is a fascinating resource for all of us to know about. So thank you once again for being here.
Oh, my pleasure.
So do you mind sharing with our viewing audience who you are and what it is you do?
I would be happy to.
Okay.
I am born and raised in the Chicagoland area.
A Midwest boy.
Yes.
Okay.
And I left to go to college when I was a youngster, and I stayed out west, and I ended up going to work computerizing factories. And found that very interesting, but elected about 11 years ago to take a year off. At the end of that year off, I was doing some volunteer work, and I became involved in this water company at that time. So I moved to Idaho from Colorado, where I was living, and the rest is history, if you will.
Interesting. Well, tell us about your water company. Tell us about Trinity Waters.
Well, Trinity
There's a lot to tell, I know.
Yeah, well,
so.
I can summarize. Trinity was incorporated in December of 1990, and we spent the first 4 years acquiring the real estate and the properties on which the springs are located. We worked quite a bit at understanding the science and the geology around the springs, because that really is quite important. We like to say source matters. Where does your water come from? And that really boils down to what is the environment that the water comes from.
Right.
And so,
and that's a big concern today.
yes.
Because we're paying so much money as consumers for bottled water. People are totally confused about what it is they really are getting and paying for and drinking. And you hear all these conflicting reports on, okay, does your water have high TDSs? Does it, is it high in total dissolved solids? Should we drink a low TDS count? Okay, that doesn't include the bacterial count. So, what is it we're doing here? And what are we exposing our bodies to? And there are no real true labeling laws, right, in this country regarding bottled waters, or specific laws?
I think it's fair to say that, that they could be improved upon.
Vastly. You're being very generous, Mark. There aren't any labeling laws to speak of, are there? I mean, truly.
Well, there are some labeling laws. There are what's called standards of identity for the terms that are used on the front of a water bottle. So the terms, such terms as spring water or natural water.
What does natural mean?
As soon as we get into the actual definitions, then I think your comment is well taken. Because in fact, the terms are played fast and loose, and the word natural water really describes quite a wide range of quality.
Does it mean it's a water source that's a natural source, like a lake, river, or stream, or it's a tap source? Or can it mean either or?
Natural water is actually a very loose term, and it means that the water is from a source other than a municipality.
Well, that's pretty loose.
That's pretty loose.
So
now,
it could come from my grandpa's pond in his backyard. What are you telling me here?
Well, let's go to the best that the FDA has.
Okay.
And that will help set the tone. The best that the FDA has is a term used, spring water.
Which means it must come from a spring.
Yes.
But
now,
the quality of that spring is not included in spring water.
It must come from a spring, and that spring must meet certain guidelines for contaminants.
Are those loose guidelines as well?
Let's put it this way. The guidelines are not as tight as they could be to affect very pure, high-quality water, and they're not as high as the standards that are used in Europe, where the old cultures And the people of Europe really understand and relate to source
Okay,
and how
now,
important source is.
Mark, I'm taking you down another highway here real quickly, but from what I understand as a consumer and a nutritionist, and I do a great deal of educating, our underground water tables in this country are extraordinarily contaminated. There are over, from what I understand, 6,000 or 13,000 chemicals, I believe, that are being used right now in agribusiness. There are over 6,000 pesticides, of which only 20% have been tested for human safety and efficacy. These chemical compounds somewhat mimic estrogen compounds in the body. They're what we call endocrine disruptors, right? So we're not only talking about pesticides and we're talking about contaminated water tables, we're talking about drinking water that comes from these sources, so we don't necessarily get what we think we're getting when we buy bottled waters. We have to be concerned about the chemicals, the organo compounds, and the bacteria. Am I correct?
Yes.
That's a lot to worry about as a consumer.
Indeed.
So how do you know? How do you know what you're getting, other than the fact that we could drink Trinity, which we'll get into in a moment, which is an amazing water. But how does the consumer, the average Joe, know what he's getting when he walks into his store?
The average Joe does not know what they're getting. And that's really what we're here to talk about. What do you do about that? Okay, so the first thing you do is you recognize that if a company is proud of their product,
Okay.
they will tell you more about it on the label.
Okay.
Terms that are evasive, such as natural sparkling or natural water, as opposed to saying spring water. Those are terms that are used really to confuse, in our opinion.
And natural on any food label actually is confusing
Somewhat
because it means
confusing.
nothing, because natural means nothing.
Doesn't tell you
regarding
what
food
standard
products.
is being held to.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
So, simply put, ask where your water comes from.
Call the source, the bottling source?
Absolutely.
Do they lie?
Look on every bottled water label, and the ones that are willing to put their source on the label, now you're getting warm. That's better.
Okay, so
If
they
they're-
tell you where it's bottled.
If they're proud of their source, they're going to put it on the bottle. If it's municipal tap water, they're either going to try and avoid putting it on the label or hide it.
Okay. Now, the one thing that I'd like to get in before we take a break here real quick is I understand that the water source you have actually comes from around 250 miles below the Earth's surface. Now, we need to take
2.2 miles.
2.2 miles, so that makes a big difference in the actual source.
Yes, source
Okay.
does matter.
Okay, source does matter, ladies and gentlemen. Stay with us. We're going to talk more about bottled waters and Trinity water in just a moment.
We're Everclear, just your average band of losers and one-hit wonders.
You know, when I was a kid, it was always assumed that drugs were cool. I'd do any drug on the table. It didn't matter what it was. Man, I was wrong.
Never talk about the damage it's going to do to you physically and mentally.
It takes your life away from you. I threw away 14 years of my life. Sad. I used to be a stupid rock and roll cliche. Don't listen to me. Don't listen to anybody. Figure it out for yourself. I don't know what else to say.
Good evening and welcome back once again to Health Quest, and Mark Johnson is with us again this evening from Idaho, visiting us from Trinity Waters. And we're talking about water and the essential for all of our lives, which is that living source that gives us all vitality and gives us all nourishment, and that's water. And we need to know what it is we're putting in our bodies. And we left off before talking about how the consumer can actually kind of assess what it is they're buying. And you gave us maybe 3 tips, was it, Mark? Could you repeat those?
I would love to. You go up to the water shelf in a grocery store and there's 200 offerings. and what do?
Right.
So what I said was, you look for a water company that is proud of its source.
Okay.
That's big. So you read the labels
And they
look
say bottled at the source.
bottled at the source, and they name the source and the location. That's number one. You want a good quality water, it's got to have the source on it. They've got to be willing to name the source. Secondly, ask the bottler, the manufacturer, what's in it. And that's a full analysis. And every water company ought to be willing and be proud of that as well.
Do they do analyses? And if they don't drink it. I take it.
Absolutely. If they will not give you an analysis, end of game. Go to the next one.
And in the analyses, what should the consumer look for?
Okay, now that's a little trickier. There's a little more education involved, and we won't be doing that here in this show, but let me just say that they ought to be willing to offer you the complete annual analysis of that water.
Okay.
And then go to one of your friends that's a scientist or that might know a little bit about reading such a report, or you can go to your local health extension. That's your county health, district health office, and someone there oftentimes will be able to help you understand that water analysis a little better.
Or the Department of Agriculture, perhaps.
Correct, or an extension out of one of the universities. So that's the second step, that is, ask what's in your water. So first we ask where does it come from? Then we ask what's in it.
So we'll be able to see like heavy metal counts as well as bacterial counts.
Correct.
Both.
And and you want to request both analyses, both the physical analyses, that's the constituents that are in the water, the minerals, the metals, and whether or not there are any organic compounds. Those are the things you don't want in water.
Do they
Pesticides.
assess that? They can assess that?
Precisely, and that is the full analysis that is required. Now, when people say there's no laws, no bottled water laws, that's not exactly true. The FDA does have guidelines. They require, for example, an annual complete analysis that's complete according to the FDA.
Can they cheat on those?
No, these are EPA certified laboratories. Now, that isn't to say there aren't illegal dealings, but let's just go with what's common sense.
Faith in this, right?
Yeah, you have to have some faith that the laboratories are doing a good job, they're certified, and that they will provide. The key is whether the manufacturer, the bottler, will provide you with that analysis. And that's really such a great indication, because if they're hesitant about that, or they send you a summary, you might pretty much assume that there's something they're not that happy about or not proud of.
So the consumer really needs to become proactive and go to the store and take a pad of paper and a pen and write down these numbers and call these people before they start consuming this on a steady basis, or have their families or children consume this on a steady basis.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's a great approach. Be proactive. Write the labels down. Understand what you're putting in your body. And thirdly, so there's three things. We said, ask where the water comes from.
Right.
And we said, ask what's in it.
Right.
Look for a good full analysis. And then thirdly, ask the manufacturer, how is the water treated or handled?
When they actually pull it out of the spring, you mean?
Yes.
Okay.
And typically bottled waters are disinfected in the United States.
With what?
It varies. Primarily, the most common disinfectant used by bottled water manufacturers is ozone. And ozone is O3, and it is injected into the water fluid itself, and it is meant to disinfect or kill
bacteria.
Kill bacteria and pathogens.
And it does? Or only certain types?
No, ozone, if properly utilized, will kill or knock back the bacterial load in water.
But not all of it.
Bottled water should never have pathogens, coliform or other disease-causing bacteria. That's absolutely a no-no. Waters have high levels, oftentimes surface spring waters, high levels of ubiquitous free-living bacteria called heterotrophic bacteria. Now, these bacteria are killed by ozonation, or most of them. Essentially, the water will last for a certain length of time after it's been disinfected. That's the shelf life of the water. You'll see the water date on the bottle, and it says 1 year from the date of bottling, typically. And that means that that water is supposed to be good for a year from the date of manufacture.
Is that true? Or does it depend on the plastic container they put it in, the thickness of the container? Because I know you was concerned about PCBs and...
Yes. Is it true? Not always. Not always. It really depends.
What's the consumer to do?
Look, it goes back to the source.
Yes.
We're going to tell you once again, it really depends on where the water comes from. If it's coming from a high-quality spring source and it's properly manufactured, bottled, then you have a good chance of getting a good product.
How else do they disinfect waters, if not ozonate them?
They use chlorine and then remove the chlorine with a carbon filter. Now, that's rather common in low-quality waters because it's easy to do.
So you need to ask about
how it's treated or handled.
Okay.
What kind of pipes they run the water through. Get them to talk about their process and their system. Now, again, this is reaching a little bit into the subject for the consumer, but people do... We say you are what you eat.
Right.
But in the case of water, your body is 70% water. So you really are more what you drink.
Sure.
And so it's worth a few minutes of your time to look into it and ask these three basic questions. Where does your water come from? What's in it? And how is it treated or handled?
This is a lot. So here's the thing that people really do need to know too, and you shared this with me earlier, that there are over 1,300 chemical compounds in our municipalities in water filtration systems today.
Now
once
this
we drink it.
statistic surprised me, and I've been studying water for 15 years. And that was on a Dateline NBC program last year, and they indicated that the average municipal system in the United States contains over 1,300 man-made compounds.
Wow.
That's a lot. Now most of these compounds are below EPA's contaminant level.
But who's to say that the total toxic load on individuals is invariant, number one. And number two, we know for a fact that since the 70s, of our 3,200 municipalities that filter our water in this country, something like 3,000 of them actually have been violating our safe drinking water laws since the 70s. And no one has done a thing to improve on that. And I think we were also talking earlier, and you were telling me that the water in Chicago is not going to improve. Not for a while.
Well, the EPA has granted the city of Chicago an extension on their violations. Chicago's
Oh, good.
Chicago's tap water exceeds EPA lead levels more than 50% of the time.
Right.
And we all know why that is.
Right.
These pipes were installed here in
Long
Chicago
time ago.
50 years ago, and they're high in lead.
We're going to be right back to talk about our lead, but beyond that, we're going to talk about what you can do about it and what type of water we can find that will actually nourish your body like crazy. So stay with us, and we'll be back with Mark in a moment.
It's time for another happy heroin hint. Hey gang, share needles and risk HIV rather than miss a single opportunity to get high. Heroin. Dying's the easy part. It's time for another happy heroin hint. You'll never have a high as good as your first, but feel free to die trying. Heroin. Dying's the easy part. It's time for another happy heroin hint. Tame those bothersome convulsions for just $200 a day. Heroin. Dying's the easy part.
Welcome back to Health Quest. Once again, Deborah Arneson here with Mark Johnson from Trinity Waters. And Mark and I were just talking during our commercial break about the amount of toxins and pesticides that have been dumped into our environment over the past 10 years, is it? How many tons?
Well, the statistic that I gave you, which is shocking actually, and there are two statistics. The first one is related to the amount of pesticide, or the amount of toxins that were either injected into the surface of the planet or dumped into the waterways by manufacturers between 1994 and 98, and that's 1 billion pounds of toxic chemicals. And then the other statistic that's equally alarming is the amount of pesticides that are dumped, herbicides and pesticides, by American farmers each year on the soil in America, and that's 1 billion pounds of those compounds. Now these are man-made compounds that are not necessarily good for you.
I'll say they're not good for us, and no one really knows the ramifications of those chemicals, those pesticides and herbicides. So
I think that's an understatement. I'll also say that the interaction, you know, you've heard about drug interactions, right? When you take this compound for this ailment, this compound for this ailment, and then they find out that when those compounds interact, something else happens.
Something horrible, right?
There have been precious little studies done on the relationship between interactions of these toxic compounds.
Well, we're the studies. We're the guinea pigs. You know, I mean, this will be talked about probably in another, 50 to 100 years, and we'll all be, cut open and examined, and then you'll have the data. So, yay. But let's talk about, rather than giving everyone bad news here, let's give everyone some good news. And let's talk about Trinity Waters, which are really spectacular waters. Can you tell us why they're special? I mean, I had one of my healers in my center the other day walk up to a bottle of water, the bottle that Charlie had brought in, and she just put her hand on it. She said, "Feel the vibration in this water." She goes, "Do you feel that?" And I was like, "No, I'm a little busy right now," but she goes, "May I have this water?" I said, "Sure, you may have it." And, I tasted it, and it tasted fabulous. It didn't have any of that kind of smell that you get with bottled water, that aftertaste that leaves kind of a funky metallic taste in your mouth. So it is exceptional, and I know that you have gone through rigorous studying and testing via the European circuit circuit, right, that shows whether or not a water is highly certifiable, and they have very high standards in Europe, as I understand it. So tell me all about it.
Okay. Well, again, let's start at the source.
Okay.
Begin at the beginning.
Okay.
Go to the source. So in the case of Trinity, source matters. Where the water comes from really matters. And in the case of Trinity Springs, there's a formation of granite in Idaho that's known the world throughout as one of the largest formations of granite on the planet. The formation covers 23,000 square miles on the surface of Idaho and goes down 20 miles. It's like a big giant molar. Now, this is pretty much a solid body of rock. That is an impenetrable barrier.
To keep toxins away from the water table, the
from
source.
this particular water.
Right.
Our springs are located in the south central portion of that batholith, and the springs have been carbon dated. You can actually date water. Isn't that fascinating?
Like a dinosaur tooth?
Yeah.
Okay.
Precisely. It's the amount, it measures the amount of atmospheric carbon that remains in the water from its long trip from the last time it was on the surface of the planet.
How old is this water?
16,000 years old.
16,000 years old. It
So-
must be so pristine, because dinosaurs couldn't even penetrate this water source with their remains, right?
And so this water has been circulating in the granite,
Okay.
deep within the earth,
Okay.
at temperatures over 300 Fahrenheit for 16,000 years under tremendous pressure.
No bacteria.
No bacteria, no pathogens. This distillation process, now keep in mind that it's very interesting related to this water, is it lives in quartz. It lives in a very high silica environment, which is fascinating. But this circulation process at this high temperature has produced a water that is free of chemical compounds,
Right.
metals.
Right.
There are no pathogens
Right.
and no harmful bacteria.
Fabulous.
This water is considered microbiologically wholesome, and it has a vitality which is, you can taste it and feel it when you put it in your body.
All right, we have to unfortunately wrap this up, Mark, okay? But we're going to talk, we're going to have Mark back again next week, and we're going to share with you everything he knows, which is just tons of information about more water information, as well as the Trinity water source. So stay tuned. We'll tell you where to find this water product, and again, it's going to bring vitality to your cells. Until then, please take good care of your health and think about what it is you're putting in your body. I'm Deborah Arneson with Health Quest, and good night.